What if the most dramatic turning points in Latin American history weren't simply local struggles or Cold War side stories, but chapters in a hidden geopolitical strategy crafted thousands of miles away? What if behind every toppling government, every rising dictator, every spontaneous revolution, and every civil war that seemed to erupt from internal tensions, there was a shadow network pulling threads, choosing winners and losers, and shaping the destinies of entire nations? Imagine learning that many of the leaders celebrated or condemned in history books were not the products of their own country's politics, but the outcomes of secret decisions made in Washington offices, whispered between intelligence officers, corporate lobbyists, and government strategists. Today, we uncover the true story of the CIA in Latin America. How and why one of the most powerful intelligence agencies in the world became deeply embedded in the political evolution of the Western Hemisphere. This isn't about conspiracy theories. This is about declassified documents, first-hand accounts, and the historical record, revealing how covert ideology, economic interests, and geopolitical fears collided to reshape nations. So here's the question. If one agency could change the course of Latin American history, how much of what we think we know about American foreign policy is only the surface of a much deeper truth? And how much of that hidden history still echoes in the present day? To understand why the CIA became so deeply involved in Latin America, we have to rewind to the final years of World War II, when the world order was being rewritten. The United States emerged from the war as a global superpower, but victory came with a new fear: the rise of Soviet influence. In 1947, the National Security Act created the CIA, granting it extraordinary freedom to operate in the shadows. Unlike previous U.S. intelligence efforts, which had limits, oversight, and clear mandates, the CIA was born with a broad, vague directive: protect American national security by any means necessary. And that phrase, any means necessary, became the foundation of the agency's identity. Latin America almost instantly became a focus for several reasons. First, geography. The Western Hemisphere was considered America's backyard, the first line of defense against global communism. Second, economics. U.S. companies had enormous investments in Latin America: mining, agriculture, energy, infrastructure, shipping, and Washington viewed left-leaning governments as threats to corporate interests. Third, ideology. Many Latin American countries were experimenting with land reforms, social programs, and nationalist policies. To Washington, these looked dangerously similar to socialism. But perhaps the most important reason was perception. U.S. leaders convinced themselves that even small political shifts, even the election of a progressive politician, could trigger a domino effect, toppling the region into Soviet influence. This assumption, often based on little evidence, shaped decades of policy. Early CIA operations in the late 1940s and early 1950s focused on political influence. Funding aligned political parties, infiltrating unions, monitoring student movements, and cultivating relationships with military officers considered reliable. But the agency quickly realized that influence wasn't enough. If a democratically elected leader threatened U.S. interests, even unintentionally, the CIA believed intervention was justified. And so, the seeds of a new era were planted, an era in which covert operations would replace diplomacy and regime change would become a tool for shaping hemispheric politics. Guatemala in the early 1950s became the birthplace of the CIA's modern regime change playbook. The democratically elected president, Jacobo Arbenz, believed in land reform as a pathway to reducing poverty. It was a popular policy inside Guatemala, but a direct threat to one enormous company, the United Fruit Company, an American corporation that owned vast plantations, railroads, and port facilities. United Fruit had friends in Washington, powerful friends, top U.S. officials, including the Secretary of State and the CIA director, had personal and financial ties to the company. So when Arbenz pushed for land redistribution, United Fruit painted him as a communist sympathizer, even though he wasn't. The CIA stepped in with Operation PB Success, a groundbreaking covert mission that would become a model for decades. Instead of a full-scale military invasion, the CIA used psychological warfare. They created a fake radio station, broadcasting reports of massive rebel forces advancing on the capital, forces that didn't exist. They spread rumors, bribed key officers, forged documents linking Arbenz to Moscow, and created the illusion of a national uprising. Then they backed a small group of exiles led by Carlos Castillo Armas, presenting him as the leader of a people's liberation movement. The Guatemalan military, overwhelmed by the illusion of a powerful revolution and fearing U.S. intervention, refused to defend the president. Arbenz resigned, knowing the alternative was a bloodbath. The aftermath was devastating. Castillo Armas dismantled land reforms, imprisoned political opponents, and paved the way for decades of brutal military rule and civil conflict. The CIA considered the operation a success, efficient, economical, and effective. And that was the problem, because once they saw how easily a democracy could be toppled, they started looking for other opportunities to replicate the model across the hemisphere. After Guatemala, Latin America became a chessboard. By the 1960s, the CIA had refined its strategies: manipulate elections, control media narratives, funnel money into friendly political parties, and empower military factions ready to intervene if politics moved too far left. In Brazil, President João Goulart pushed for reforms aimed at reducing inequality, controlling foreign corporations, and increasing national economic independence. Washington viewed these policies with suspicion. The CIA implemented a multifaceted pressure campaign, funding opposition politicians, supporting business elites, and encouraging military leaders to challenge the presidency. In 1964, the Brazilian military launched a coup. The CIA provided covert logistical support, naval presence offshore, and post-coup assistance to the new dictatorship. Brazil entered a 21-year period of authoritarian rule marked by censorship, torture, and political repression. Yet it remained a close U.S. ally because it was anti-communist. Chile became the centerpiece of Cold War intervention. When Salvador Allende won the presidency through democratic elections in 1970, President Nixon reportedly instructed the CIA to make the economy scream. The agency funded strikes, created propaganda campaigns, backed opposition media, and encouraged political polarization. They supported right-wing groups organizing chaos, laying the groundwork for a military takeover. On September 11, 1973, General Augusto Pinochet led a violent coup. Allende died in the presidential palace. The military dictatorship that followed became infamous for disappearances, torture centers, secret police, and mass imprisonment. Chile's democracy was shattered. The CIA denied direct involvement in the coup, but admitted to creating conditions that made it possible. Meanwhile, Operation Condor, an intelligence alliance between South American dictatorships, coordinated the kidnapping, torture, and killing of opponents across borders. The CIA knew about Condor, supported aspects of it, and maintained relationships with many of the participating regimes. These interventions weren't isolated events. They were part of a systematic effort to maintain a hemisphere free from socialist influence. But the cost was paid by millions who lived and died under repressive regimes. By the 1980s, attention shifted to Central America, where revolutions, dictatorships, and insurgencies were colliding. In Nicaragua, the Somoza dynasty had ruled for decades with U.S. support. When the Sandinista movement overthrew Somoza in 1979, the U.S. saw it as a catastrophic loss. The CIA began funding, arming, and training the Contras, rebel groups seeking to topple the new government. This covert support continued even after Congress banned further funding, leading to the Iran-Contra scandal, selling weapons to Iran and diverting profits to the Contras. The Contras carried out kidnappings, assassinations, and attacks on civilian targets. In El Salvador, the U.S. spent billions supporting the government during its civil war, despite widespread reports of massacres, death squads, and military units targeting civilians. The CIA assisted in intelligence training and coordination, justifying involvement as necessary to combat communist insurgency. Similar patterns unfolded in Guatemala's civil war, where military forces carried out genocidal campaigns against indigenous communities. The CIA's role varied, sometimes extensive, sometimes indirect, but always influential. Washington's logic was simple: prevent the spread of leftist governments, no matter the human cost. But that cost was enormous. Tens of thousands were killed or disappeared. Entire villages were destroyed. Children were orphaned. Refugees fled by the millions. These wars reshaped Central America's demographics, politics, and economies for generations. And despite the violence, the CIA maintained the stance that these operations were essential to national security, an argument that still sparks debate today. As the Cold War ended, many Latin American nations began confronting the truth about their pasts. Truth commissions revealed secret prisons, death flights, mass graves, and decades of state terror. Declassified U.S. documents confirmed what many suspected. The CIA had been deeply involved, often knowingly supporting regimes and groups responsible for severe human rights abuses. The agency rarely expressed remorse, instead framing its actions as products of their time, necessary steps to prevent Soviet expansion. But the ripple effects didn't disappear with the fall of the Berlin Wall. In many countries, distrust of government institutions remains widespread. Economic instability can be traced back to decades of artificially controlled policies. Social divisions fueled by Cold War politics still shape modern elections, and U.S.-Latin American relations remain complicated, with many countries remembering intervention long after American textbooks moved on. Understanding this history isn't about assigning blame to individuals decades later. It's about recognizing how global powers shape the world, intentionally or not. It's about questioning how much secrecy a democracy can tolerate before it contradicts its own values. And it's about acknowledging that the actions of a single agency operating in shadows can change the course of nations. So after everything we've uncovered, the coups, the covert networks, the psychological warfare, the dictatorships, the civil wars, and the long-term consequences, you have to ask yourself, how different would Latin America look today without the CIA's influence? Would some countries be more stable, more prosperous, more democratic? Or would other powers have stepped in and taken advantage of the same political fractures? What did you think about today's video? Comment your thoughts and suggestions for my next video below.